All right, you guys, welcome back to part two in this series of lessons in which we are talking about heart failure. And in this lesson, we're going to do a good overview of the differences between our systolic and our diastolic heart failure. So keep on watching if you guys want to have a better understanding of these two. But before we begin, if this is your first time to our channel and watching one of our videos, then I do invite you guys to subscribe to our channel down below. Make sure though that you guys hit that bell notification, that way you'll be notified as soon as our new lessons become available. As always, we really value your subscriptions, the likes, as well as the comments that you guys leave for us on here, and those really do go a long way to help support this channel here. So for that, I do want to say thank you to you guys. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Eddie Watson, and I'm going to be presenting this lesson for you. Alright, so let's go ahead and get into the meat and potatoes of this lesson. Like I said, this lesson is going to be the second lesson in our series that we have here on heart failure. And in particular, we're going to be talking about the differences between systolic and diastolic. If you remember from our last video, which I will link to up above, in that video we gave you guys a really good overview of what heart failure is. In that lesson, we did talk about some of the pathophysiology and these differences between systolic and diastolic, but it was at a real quick overview, 10,000-foot view. And in this lesson, I want to go a little bit further into that in order to give you guys more of an understanding of what's happening here. So up on the screen, I have the examples of the three hearts that we were looking at. We obviously have our normal heart here in the middle, the example of a heart in systolic heart failure on the left, and the example of a heart in diastolic failure on the right. And like I said in the last lesson, heart failure can really be due to one of these two primary dysfunctions, either a systolic dysfunction or a diastolic dysfunction. And while there certainly are some similarities in these, if we look at the etiology and the pathophysiology of these, they are quite different. But ultimately, they're going to lead to the same result. We're going to end up with decreased cardiac function, which essentially means that we have a decreased cardiac output. So despite whether this is a systolic problem or a diastolic problem, the end result is you're just not going to be getting enough blood flow throughout the system. Now, as we get into this lesson, it is important to know that some of the underlying processes that ultimately shape whether a person ends up in systolic or diastolic heart failure, they aren't quite known, and sometimes the same factors can end up leading someone into a systolic failure versus the same thing leading another person into a diastolic failure. So it's important to know that these exact reasons, we don't quite have a great grasp on that yet, so you may see some conflicting information when we start talking about some of these causes. But so the first one that we're going to talk about here is our systolic heart failure. And as the name suggests, this is a problem that has to deal with systole. And as we know, systole is when the heart is contracting and injecting the blood. Therefore, we know that systolic heart failure is going to be a problem with our contraction. So as I mentioned in the first lesson, systolic heart failure is the inability of the heart to pump with enough force, and thus it's unable to meet the body's demands. And it's this decreased force of contraction. This is also known as decreased contractility, or what is also known as decreased inotropy. So again, going back to our cardiac output equation, we know if we have a decreased force of contraction, we have a decreased stroke volume, and this is ultimately going to lead to a decrease in our cardiac output. One of the ways that we can measure this contraction is if we look at the amount of blood that's ejected. And if we compare that blood to the amount of blood that was in the ventricle to begin with, we end up with something that we call the ejection fraction, or what you'll often see referred to as our EF. Now, a normal EF is anywhere from 50 to 70%, so we don't even eject all the blood to begin with in a normal healthy heart. But in order for someone to be classified as systolic heart failure, they're going to end up with an ejection fraction that's less than 40%. And this is important to know because this is going to be one of our main signs for systolic heart failure. Now, as well as like we talked about from the last lesson, you're going to end up with this weakened heart muscle, as well as these enlarged ventricles. And so if you look over at the normal heart and you compare the wall of the heart here to the size of the ventricle that we have here, you can definitely see in systolic heart failure that wall is much thinner and those chambers are much larger. And so like we had talked about, so the underlying disease that the patient has, which we're going to talk about some of those in just a minute here, ultimately lead to the death of muscle cells. This leads to decreased contraction and ejection of the blood, essentially a weakened heart muscle. And so if we think about those compensation mechanisms, one of the ways that the body can compensate is by increasing our preload. And by increasing this preload, it's going to put more pressure and more stretch upon those ventricles, but we also have less muscle cell that's left alive in there. And so this is what can lead to these enlarged ventricles, but again, having those weak heart muscle walls. And so let's actually go ahead and talk about some of these causes that are going to lead our patient into systolic heart failure. And remember that heart failure is going to be a secondary condition. So a patient has some other underlying disease which has caused the death of muscle cell within the heart. And that's ultimately what progresses into heart failure. So the first of these causes that we're going to talk about is going to be as the result of a decrease in blood supply to the heart. And of these causes, this is actually going to be the most common cause. And one of the biggest contributors to this is going to be coronary artery disease. So if you think about, we have impaired blood flow in those coronaries as a result of that coronary artery disease. And this impaired flow ultimately leads to the cardiac muscle cell death. This then leads to the weakened heart, like we talked about, and this is what starts that whole process of the compensation, leading to the negative feedback and continuing to compensate, and ultimately leads to that cycle of progression that we see. And so the next of these causes that we're going to talk about is something that we classify as our heart muscle disease. And this is going to be our dilated cardiomyopathy. And so this can be the result of either a genetic condition or, like I just talked about, the response to those compensatory mechanisms and that increasing of preload and really dilating out of those ventricles. Again, the attempt of this was to give more stretch and to get a better contraction and thus stroke volume. But when left unchecked and we add this in with the death of muscle cell, that we start to get those enlarged chambers with that very weak muscle. And that's exactly what we see when we look at the image here. The next of these causes that we're going to take a look at is something that we call valve disease. And this valve disease can really come in two forms that we're concerned with. The first is going to be our regurgitation. And this is where we have some sort of incompetent valve, such as a mitral valve or a tricuspid valve. And what happens is, as the ventricle contracts, this valve, because it's incompetent, allows blood to go backwards in the system instead of going forward like it's supposed to. This obviously means that less blood is going to be ejected, leading to a decreased cardiac output, and again can lead to the progression of heart failure. The other valve disease that we're going to look at here is going to be our stenosis. And again, this is going to be another incompetent valve, but what's happening here now is when we're looking at either our aortic or our pulmonic, that these valves are in charge of regulating the blood going out from the ventricle, and with a stenosed valve, it makes it much harder, creates a much smaller pathway for that blood to eject from. Again, this makes it more difficult for the heart to beat against, and as a result, we're going to end up with less blood that's ejected with each beat. So now, while the pathophysiology of these two valve diseases in the progression of heart failure are quite a bit different, they ultimately again lead to the same thing of decreased cardiac output. And so the body is going to attempt to increase the workload, remember, increase heart rate or attempt to increase stroke volume. And this is going to lead to an increase in demand of those cardiac muscle cells. And ultimately, we have a demand problem, so we're going to end up with cell death as a result, and thus a weaker heart, and we just continue down that cycle of progression. Now, finally, the last cause that I'm going to talk about here are going to be our arrhythmias. And this can either be one that's going to be too slow, or it can be too fast, or it can even be uncoordinated. So think the left and the right side aren't beating in synchronization with each other. So either that dysynchrony between ventricles or a rate that's too fast or too slow, these all can ultimately lead to a decrease in cardiac output. And as we know in our patients with heart failure, this decrease in cardiac output means the compensation mechanisms are not going to be working in our favor. And so really, if we look at the cycle of what's happening here, we have some sort of underlying disease, which that disease has led to muscle cell death, giving us a decreased pumping ability or a decreased force of contraction. This means we're going to have that decreased cardiac output, which is going to lead to the compensation, which is going to increase the workload of the heart, which this means that we have an increase in demand. And again, we have a demand problem in heart failure, so this is going to lead to cell death. And as a result, that cell death is going to feed right back into a decrease in the force of contraction and start this whole cycle again. And so at this point here with the cell death, when we are looking at systolic heart failure, this means we're going to have less muscle cells. All right, I hope that made sense for you guys and that you guys have a better understanding of our systolic heart failure. So now we're going to move on and talk about our diastolic heart failure. And once again, as the name suggests, this is going to have to do with diastole, which, as we know, diastole is when the heart is filling with blood prior to contraction. So we can really think of diastolic heart failure as being a problem with the filling. But just like systolic heart failure, the heart is unable to pump enough blood to meet the body's demands. So therefore, the heart is not filling with enough blood. We can also think of this as having a reduced preload. And the reason it's not filling with enough blood is because we have this hypertrophy going on. So if you take a look at the muscle wall here, you can see that it's much thicker than even in a normal heart, and especially compared to systolic heart failure. And so as a result, since all of this muscle cell takes up space, it's going to lead to a decrease in the size of the ventricle. And since we have a decreased smaller chamber size, partially as a result of the muscle cells taking up that space, but also partially as a result of the decreased ability of the heart to relax and sort of stretch. And so ultimately, we end up with less of an ability to eject a sufficient quantity of blood. And so just like in diastolic heart failure, the heart's unable to pump enough blood to meet the body's demand. So again, we have a limited amount of blood that's going to be ejected out here. But one of the interesting things with diastolic heart failure is that you still can have a normal EF. And this may seem counterintuitive, but if you really think about it, if we're comparing the amount of blood that's ejected to the amount of blood that we initially had in this chamber to begin with, even though we're ejecting a smaller amount of blood, if we still have that good forceful contraction, we're still going to get a proper percentage of ejection out of the ventricle. So you oftentimes can have an EF that's over 40%. And just a quick example to drive this point home and hopefully make this make sense, I'm going to use just made up numbers for the sake of going through an example to really have you guys understand the math here. But if, let's say in a normal heart, you have 100 mLs of blood that's ejected from an initial volume of 200 mLs, you're going to end up with a 50% EF. Now, let's say you're in diastolic heart failure and you reduce that volume of blood that's being ejected to 50 mLs, but you only had 100 mLs that was available in that ventricle to begin with, you're also going to end up with a 50% EF. So just because they have a normal EF doesn't mean that they're getting sufficient cardiac output from ejecting the blood throughout the system. So this is one really key takeaway from the difference between diastolic and systolic heart failure. So now when we look at diastolic heart failure, the biggest contributor to this is going to be our myocardial hypertrophy. And this is as a result of when those muscle cells die, there's this process of remodeling. those remaining muscle cells become bigger and larger, as well as our body tries to replace those cells that have died and create more muscle cells, which ultimately build up and create this situation in which we have these very large muscle cell walls in the heart. And so again, now these muscle cells are taking up the space that normally the ventricle has to fill with, and this is what ultimately leads to that decreased cardiac output. So let's go ahead and move on and talk about some of the causes for our diastolic heart failure. So the first of these that we're going to talk about, and probably the most common, is going to be our hypertension. And this is really going to be the result of that chronic hypertension. So if you think about with hypertension, we have our blood vessel here. And let's say this is the normal size of a blood vessel. Well, in hypertension, things are clamped down more and we end up with this smaller blood vessel. And if you just imagine the heart having to beat blood through a large vessel versus a small vessel, it's going to be much more difficult to go through that smaller vessel. And so since the heart is having to beat harder in order to pump against that, the heart muscle has to grow and create a more forceful contraction. In addition to that, if our patient also has some sort of stenosis, primarily aortic stenosis, again, if you think about normally you have a nice big wide open valve to eject blood through, whereas now in a patient with stenosis, you have a much smaller opening, this is also going to be harder for the heart to beat against. Once again, this is going to lead to growth of that muscle cell and to have that more forceful contraction. Now, this is where I'm going to diverge for just a quick minute and bring up the point that I had made at the beginning of this lesson, where sometimes we don't quite understand why the same underlying disease process can lead one patient into a systolic heart failure versus another patient into a diastolic heart failure. So here you can see we talked about stenosis when we talked about systolic heart failure, but here we see it coming up again as another potential cause for diastolic heart failure. So there's still a lot to be learned on these topics and what causes one person to go one way and another the other way. But I want you to understand these concepts and understand why a person might develop this myocardial hypertrophy. So the next of these causes that we're going to talk about is something that we call restrictive cardiomyopathy. And so what's happened here is we have these dead muscle cells. And as a result of these dead muscle cells, we end up with this fibrotic scar tissue. And the scar tissue is not as compliant as our normal tissue would be, and so this is going to lead to a decrease in our stretch. And so ultimately less stretch means less filling, and once again, here we are with our diastolic heart failure. Now, along with this restrictive cardiomyopathy, we also can end up with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And this is essentially a cardiomyopathy that's a result of this myocardial hypertrophy that we've already talked about. But typically in this example, this tends to be some sort of genetic issue that's led to this. So once again, as a result of this cardiomyopathy, this hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, we have these larger muscle cell walls, again leading to a smaller ventricle and less ability to fill with blood. And finally here, we do have other causes. These are things like coronary artery disease, age, and other such things like that. But once again, just like we had talked about some of these with the systolic heart failure, and I already kind of made this point with the stenosis, is we don't always know exactly why this would drive one person to one particular type of heart failure over the other. But just know that these are those risk factors that ultimately will lead us down this path. And that path, like we had talked about before, if we look in the middle again, we have that underlying disease that's led to the death of the cardiac muscle cells, giving us that decreased force of contraction, giving us a decreased cardiac output, thus increasing the workload through compensation, causing an increase in oxygen demand. This ultimately, due to our state of heart failure, leads to more cell death, and this process cycles back around, giving us a decreased force of contraction, and we continue through this progression. The only real difference here is that when we're looking at our diastolic heart failure, is instead of having less muscle cells, is we end up with this remodeled growth of the heart muscle and also this increase in our stiffness. So again, a lot of similarities between these two, a lot of differences when we look at what's actually happening and some of the reasons that things are happening and what these compensation mechanisms and how our heart is responding to them. But at the end of the day, we still end up with the same result, that decreased cardiac output and that decreased ability of our heart to meet the body's demands. All right, so that's going to end this lesson here today. We covered a good amount of information in this lesson. I really wanted to walk you guys through these differences between systolic and diastolic heart failure because at face value, they're going to look the same in terms of a lot of the symptoms that your patient is going to be presenting with. But underlying, there's a whole lot of difference between these two and a lot of different processes that are going on and leading to different outcomes. So hopefully this lesson has helped to explain that a little bit easier for you guys, to give you a better understanding of what these differences are, so that hopefully you guys will have a good understanding of taking care of these patients moving forward. And so, of course, on that note, I really want to thank you guys for watching. Like I said, I hope that you guys found value in this lesson here. If you did, please head on down and leave us a like or even a comment below and tell us what you thought of this lesson. In the next lesson, we're going to take a look at the differences between our left-sided and right-sided heart failure and hopefully help you guys to have a good understanding of some of those differences because they're quite a bit different from one another. In the meantime, feel free and check out the last lesson that we did before the heart failure series, in which we covered the Glasgow Coma Scale. Alright, as always, thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next lesson.